Welcome to Healthcare Algorhythm. I'm Dr. Will Strimmel. If you want the real story behind today's healthcare challenges and the strategies and technologies people are actually using to solve them, you're in the right place. Short conversations, clear insights, practical takeaways. Let's get into it. Hello, everyone. Yes, this is the Healthcare Algorhythm. I am Dr. Will Strimmel. Welcome back. We are recording at the start of April, and this month we're focusing on the care of seniors, arguably the group that stands to benefit the most from advances in healthcare and technology, but often the one that struggles the most to fully access and realize those benefits. And I can think of no better person to kick that conversation off with than my guest today, Tara Nastase. Tara is a seasoned senior living executive, currently serving in the role of regional director of operations, but with a diverse background in clinical care and leadership. She has experience leading multi-state community operations and driving occupancy and growth. And I think Tara really sees this industry from every angle. So Tara, it is great to have you. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So I'm sure you've seen this space evolve dramatically over time. Give us a sense of the work you're doing now, but more or less a sense of sort of the state of the union of the care of the senior in 2026, at least as it relates to senior living and senior care.
Sure, absolutely. Right now, I oversee a multi-state portfolio focused strictly on senior living, assisted living, memory care, independent living. Right now, I would say the biggest thing we're focused on is ensuring that we can care for the resident all the way from life enrichment to clinical capabilities and make sure that we're also meeting the family's needs, whatever that goes to, from pricing strategies, business development offerings, but like you said, all the way to clinical complexities. So that is really working directly with my business development partners and clinical partners, programming across the board. So it really depends on the market that we're focused on, but yeah.
And, one of the things I've been hearing consistently around this is that as folks come into your communities, or I should say communities like yours, that I think we can all understand we're all living longer. So residents are older, but their care is a little bit more complex. And perhaps patients or residents who were very independent before, now they're almost approaching skilled care needs, and now they're still coming into lower level of care. So I guess question number one is, are you seeing that as well? And if so, how does that affect the way a senior or resident and their family approach the choice or approach the decision to go into a particular community?
Sure. Absolutely, we are. And I think that the decision-making process is more rushed and they're a little more urgent for sure. So they are looking at the communities for, more resource and direction. And I believe, even the last 5, 6 years when I've come out of skilled nursing and have gone more into senior living, which is the assisted living side, the decision making, like you said, has become more rapid because they have become more clinically complex at that level. So when we're looking at, amenities and things like that, it's still very important, but the care side and clinical capabilities, what we're offering there too, very heavily come into play.
Okay, and so it's almost like you're shifting in real time from lifestyle focus to care focus. How are you doing it? What are some things that you're trying? What's working? Remains a challenge?
Sure. And, and I think we'll probably get into this later, but there's been many discussions also of where the communities are at, regions across where we go, and really kind of where the community's niche is as well. But for me personally, I'm heavily based right now currently in the Midwest, but I have very urban markets and very rural markets. But I think that the biggest thing for us is utilizing our resources, communicating very well with the families on what that looks like, and care planning prior to the move-in. And like I said, that makes it a little bit more difficult, just like anything when the families are looking for those resources and are rushed. But I still think it's on our responsibility to communicate well and discuss what our capabilities are and what that's going to look like when they're moving in.
And when you mention that it's happening a little bit more with a sense of urgency, does that mean it's often after a hospital stay, or,
Yes.
and give me a sense of what you've seen, how that's changed, kind of thing?
Sure. I would say usually it's either after a hospital stay or a skilled nursing stay where
Oh,
they're
okay.
realizing they're not meeting level of care there, or again, and this has probably been historical, but where the families are no longer able to keep, their parent at home, where they're losing their independence. But again, it's usually where they've hit that point and they're kind of scrambling now to get the information that they need. But in assisted living, it is absolutely, more partnerships with medical providers that are doing, on-site visits or after-hour cares and therapy programming. So we have either on-site extra programming, things like that, that make a difference on what we can deliver on a regular basis to keep folks from either going out to the clinics or hospitals. That makes a world of difference. And you can even see it on the like independent living side where they have wellness clinics either attached to or on the, resort style living. Not even on assisted living side, you see different ownership groups trying to add that onto independent living 55 plus, like wellness groups and things, even if they're managed from an outside medical group. Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
then how does all that coordination take place? We already have a pretty fragmented system to begin with.
Yeah, I would say more so in the senior living, it's definitely about partnership. So a lot of communication on that side. And then I do believe that a lot of that then goes back to the community and then that medical director group and making sure that there's open communication. Obviously, if they're not utilizing their primary care and things like that, there sometimes is fragments. And there's a lot of follow up that then goes back to the community leadership that they have to follow up and make sure that they're getting the documentation and things like that. So that is an area of opportunity, no doubt, just like it is when you have, skilled nursing follow up, at the hospital or with physicians, but even more so in assisted living, you do not have an assigned medical director. You can have
That's all
medical
right.
director
Okay.
groups, but it's not the same as you have in skilled nursing.
Okay, so maybe because most of us aren't familiar with that, so maybe just spend a minute or two explaining that. So if someone's in assisted living, I think I would have the concept that there's robust medical care, but not necessarily. How does that play out
Yes.
in real
So
world?
in assisted living, they are more independent, and I do wanna be clear that assisted living has a variety of different regulations between states, whereas skilled nursing, it is different between states, but it's very much more similar across the states than assisted living. Assisted living can vary based on the level of care that is provided from state to state and intricacies like that, that skilled nursing is primarily more the same. So when we talk about the medical director in skilled nursing, there's a medical director oversight and there's physicians coming in and coverage like that. In assisted living, a lot of folks choose to stay with their primary physician. And so a lot of times they'll go out and see their primary physician. A lot of time the families are taking them to their primary physician, things like that. Or, podiatrist, et cetera, nephrologist. We in assisted living and multiple, ownership groups, things like that, have started to partner with primary care groups that will do after hour calls, things like that, to kind of bridge clinical programming after hour calls to keep folks, safer. And then we also, depending on the offerings of a community organization, they do start discussing changing their provider to maybe someone in house. But in assisted living, it's very, very different than like in skilled where your provider is generally that medical director while they're there.
Right, right, right. And I would imagine this doesn't you mentioned podiatry, but there's a whole range of specialists. I mean, I saw one statistic that said for most seniors, I'm sorry, 1 in 3 seniors sees at least 5 different doctors in the course of a year or healthcare providers, NPs, PAs. So and they're usually not all in the same system, all in the same groups. And so I suppose it's even on the assisted side, it's probably great if you have a strong medical director group, but that doesn't even take into account the specialty care that has to come involved.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
and I imagine they have to go out a lot for that. So, as we start to move and talk a little bit about the technology that we're thinking about and using in the middle of all this is the care team, right? The staff. And I have to imagine it's very similar in my world. The workforce shortages are real. It's a high acuity, high burnout field in many respects. Number 1, are you seeing that as well in your space in terms of the support staff? And does this increasing acuity play a role in that? I guess is my question.
Sure. I would say, of course there's turnover, but I will say in the regions that I provide, I will say in senior living, we do see less of that.
Okay.
than skilled nursing. I will say that yes, absolutely, we see increased acuity, and we absolutely either get calls or concerns. We talk about it with the team, but again, really depending on the state regulations, we do discuss on what we can and can't care for. So it really depends. However, a lot of that comes back to resources and support that we're giving the teams on staffing and things like that for them to be able to care for those folks.
And how about the families? You've mentioned them, the families a few times. How do they play a role in this? Are their expectations changing? Are they partners, or are they looking to you really for increased levels of support?
Yeah, I would say honestly a little bit of both. In assisted living, the families generally are very involved. And like I said, we do offer transport depending on, again, the community availability. Sometimes it's so many times a month, but it really, some of the burden in assisted living does go to families, and sometimes they provide that and wants to. But that's a lot of what we were talking about. Sometimes the disconnect if you go to a specialist and the paperwork usually goes with the family or that person, because in
Right.
assisted living, they're a lot more, independent and things like that. So they are the advocate and they are the one leading those processes more in assisted living. That being said, there's still absolutely, and there should be, the responsibility and them wanting that follow up on what we're doing for their care planning. All of those things still happen assisted living where we are required to walk through those interventions and et cetera.
Now, how are you starting to think about leveraging technology to address these things? I mean, I would imagine, you've been doing this a while. You've probably seen in the senior care space the evolution of senior focused electronic health records or, applications and whatnot. What I'm sure you've seen also a lot of things tried and not work out so well. So, what's been solved fairly effectively? What's worked? What's made a big difference? And where are the gaps still remaining?
Sure. I think, of course, electronic health records are huge. Just doing, acquisitions and changes and things like that. We've still taken over communities that are still doing paper. I will say just for visibility and things like that, that is one of the things, no matter the organization, generally, that's the first thing that when we do, we try to get visibility on electronic health records, not only for our providers, but our regional teams to support and things like that. So no doubt, there's some top players in EHRs and things like that, but it is still, even with, outside resources, it's still fairly siloed to your organization though. However, we can integrate that with therapy and our providers that we have, whether I said those after hour providers
Mhm.
and things like that. But the burden still does lie on our folks to share documents and things like that with the providers when they're going off site and printing and, EMS, all of those things. As far as, any other technology, I come from the acute side of the healthcare and being a respiratory therapist. So I will say post-acute, and I don't think that there's many people that can argue this, is generally always a little bit behind, right? Is acute care.
Is
That
that
being,
is that because there's just not the return on investment there, or why is that?
I would say, um, maybe a little bit about maybe a little of that, and then really implementation, and I would say really the accessibility and really what we're wanting to gain out of it. And then I would say that all that to say is I think the resources that we have in a community, and whether it's skilled or assisted living, I think we do have to, I think, look at it reasonably. And I know that that's an interesting thing to say, but one thing, the only way I can explain this is one thing that I think if folks actually had started out in acute care and then worked a couple years in post acute is the amount of resources, and I mean people, technology, but equipment, setup, physical plant is vastly different. And so it's not just an equipment, or not just in a technology thing, but if you take equipment, people, all those things. So not just monetarily. I mean, there's a whole gamut of things. I mean, and just like think about IT, even if you've got a critical access hospital, that in an organization that may have, 20 assisted living communities, that's still very different on the setup.
Sure.
So all of that bandwidth, I think, really comes into play. And that's just like I said, at my level, how I think about it. But it is vastly different, I think, the comparison to that.
Yeah, I would imagine most of us don't have that differentiation in our head, right? We think it's probably all this seamless, just continuity of Oh, okay, you leave the hospital, you're gonna go to some kind of skilled nursing for a short period of time. It's probably gonna be pretty similar to the hospital. No, assisted living. Oh, they probably no, no, it's not because and that's where I was getting with the not just so much the healthcare, the workforce, but just healthcare dollars are strained. And that's one of the hopes I think of these emerging technologies is that we're gonna be able to solve or at least begin to seriously address a lot of problems that it was just too difficult. They were too difficult to solve with humans because of too time and resource intensive. But we still have a long way to go. And I think, we're probably seeing it at the high end. And part of even the impetus for the show is that we have all these great technologies and even especially around seniors but, who are they solving for right now? I think they're solving for help for bigger systems, enterprises, right? But it's about bringing these tools down to the level of the patient and the provider in real time is I think is a challenge.
Yeah. And I was actually, I think it was either another podcast or no, somebody else was also talking about the implementation of some of these. I don't know. It actually might have been yours, but it is very interesting on the implementation of like where the breakdown is because it can be like multiple areas. But I think sometimes when we roll something out, and it is over, multi community. Again, it's not just a big hospital system where everybody can, follow up, but, we might have 10 different communities in 3 different states. And what does that look like? What does that look like for how we're giving them support as far as education? Teams in these communities are smaller on the bandwidth. So, what are we doing for education and follow up? And where does that come from the vendor side versus the organizational side? Right? And so I think that a lot of questions and curiosity need to be put into that to make sure that the rollout is appropriate. I am very pro post acute care. I see a lot of amazing people from investor groups to ownership to direct line staff that have the capability to do these things. I just think sometimes we need to just be more curious. So when we're rolling out, we're asking the right questions so it's done and then it can have sustainability. Truly from when I've, transitioned from the respiratory therapist to business development and all of these things, I have seen the majority of most organizations and everything really trying to do things the right way and really try to amp up to meet the increasing clinical needs. And I do have a soft spot for sure with skilled nursing because there is some really heavy clinical folks that they LTAC had changed some of their requirements that really now have passed LTAC and gone into skilled.
So LTAC, for those who don't know who are listening, LTAC long-term acute care, slightly different than skilled, right? I mean, those are even sicker people.
Yes. Yes. And so, skilled nursing absolutely has taken on those folks. And like I said, LTACs are more set up for sure, like a hospital. And so then we have these folks that absolutely the burden is on, skilled for taking people that they can say that they can take care of. However, this is absolutely what they have to do, but it is in a different plant structure. It is different with, we do not have respiratory therapists. We do not have all of the things that a hospital has. And I do feel like the post acute realm really has tried and has implemented a lot of things to try to meet those standards.
Okay, so you think there's improvements and there's hope. Things are getting better for those
Yeah,
folks
absolutely.
because they have
No
a very
doubt.
difficult job in that setting. So as you take a step back maybe and put your industry leader hat on and you look at the state of affairs, senior care community is clearly rapidly growing for the reasons we discussed. We're living longer and we have more complex medical care. What the next 3 to 5 years, what do you think are going to be the big themes that are going to be people are going to be talking about in your world? When you go to the big conferences, what are the keynote speakers going to be addressing?
And I think just from, being on LinkedIn and hear different folks talk, I will say that I think specifically for senior living, to your point of clinically complex in life enrichment, I do think depending on, demographically where you're at and rural, urban, I do think that folks kind of will be in a niche of whether they are going more lifestyle and, can do more of what that 55 plus and what amenities that we can bring, not that that's not an expectation in every assisted living and things like that, because that is the purpose and the drive, and we wanna promote independence. But I think in some areas, we absolutely are going to be expected more of what the clinical capabilities are. And just talking to leaders that I know that they are more in that spot, whether it's due to competition or any of the other items that play into that, that they are the ones that are more apt to have to increase their capabilities and programming in that
Do you think that's going to force, and consolidation might not be the right word, but do you think that's going to push communities to think more of, "Hey, we have a collection of different options as people move through the care continuum," as opposed to, is it going to be harder for, let's say, a lifestyle focused standalone or maybe two standalone without that ability to say, okay, your needs have changed. People are coming in with already maybe close to higher needs. Your needs have changed all of a sudden. Either, we have somewhere else that you can go or we're going to lose that person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that from what I have seen and experienced, you generally have like organizational groups that will either focus on the high lifestyle amenities, and that's what they try to be really good at, or you have folks that really, like and center around those clinical complexities, and that's what their teams work towards. However, if you do have an organization or wants that, usually they offer the gamut of affordable housing and clinical complexity. And then they'll have some of those more robust areas where they have multiple housing and, the pool and the amenities
Right.
and the yoga and then the steam room, and so all of those things where, yes, they may have a wellness clinic, but either the referrals or the residents that they're taking may not be as complex because they have made a niche in a different thing. You've seen that already, I think, in post acute care. I think it's becoming more like that in assisted living for sure.
Okay. So if you now think about the challenges that remain, all right, the big problems that people are going to be trying to solve, and let's just focus on what technology can do in that space right now. If you were sitting in the room with a developer and they could fix it, kind of solve any problem for you with the technology. And of course, by the way, technology doesn't necessarily mean, or I should say, innovation doesn't necessarily mean just computers and technology and robots and AI, right? And there's lots of things that are innovation that aren't necessarily hard. But if you were working with a group of people or a group of developers who could really solve a problem with these emerging technologies, what would you have them tackle?
Gosh, there's probably a list. I do think support, and there's multiple reasons why I'm gonna say this, but of course there is always like the clinical support. I do think that, we have a regional team, but and I know there's already multiple things out there, but one of the items that folks talk about now that are being implemented or, even in memory care is predictive falling, what's going to get there, fall risk and interventions, that's an issue no matter whether you're in assisted living, skilled or whatever is, what is either going to predict it, scan for it, make sure that we have the intervention. So I think that just across the board in organizations, if they're not already investing, I think that that is going to be conversational around that. And then I think, anything that assists our leaders to be more present with our team members to grow them, either,
Okay.
personally or professionally, and take away from desk time. And that can be a lot, right? That could be anything from financials. And there is a lot of innovations and just, whether it's the organization I'm with now or, I just see, working with other colleagues or whatever that they are implementing to try to take away some of those executive more duties that
Sure.
are being task related to make them more present with the residents and the staff because, no matter what kind of technology, you're going to need folks being present to know what's going on and to make sure the care is being taken care of.
But that's a great place in healthcare because a lot of the things that we do are somewhat repetitive and there is absolutely opportunities. I'll give you the simplest example that I can think of right off the top of my head is AI scribes. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but now, many people go into a doctor's office. The doctor doesn't have to sit and type the note anymore. I mean, that's not that's not medical professional work. That's really administrative work. It can be recorded and just transcribed for them. And so that's saving a lot of time, a lot of burnout. But here's the key question. Do you think the senior care community is positioned and ready to invest in it? Are they or I should say, are there communities that are thinking we really need to be like progressive and thinking about these emerging technologies? Or are they still very just focus on solving for what is a tough business.
Yes, I will say there absolutely is. And again, I think I've had more exposure or whatever over the last 3 years to different organizations, different leaderships, different investment groups. And so it is very dependent on their bandwidth, the amount of communities, obviously, right? Whether you own a few or multi, or whether you're doing, what you're going to invest in and what you're providing, obviously, is going to have to match up. But
Mhm.
I absolutely believe that there's organizations that are very highly interested and like I said, I do have contacts and stuff that are already starting to implement some of those things
Yeah.
and invest
They're
those. So
looking for that return on investment if they
a
can see
hundred,
it.
100%. And I think the biggest thing is too, and this will always be a thing, is whatever that they can implement and or provide, if it is going to show to our referring partners and families and residents that we're the place to be, right? And we can provide and show that in either quality outcomes or it just, I mean, it provides us the security, whether it's survey or things like that. I don't think there's an operator in the world, if you show the return on investment in quality care and reduction of tags and fines and things like that, that wouldn't want to invest over time, you know? So I absolutely think that the interest is there and those things. I will say, because it hasn't been as much, of course, then another question is always, show me, what that
Sure.
return would look like, just like anyone.
Yeah, and I think we've rapidly moved into an era where it's not just a great idea that's really getting traction anymore. I mean, there's so the way technology is evolving lately is there. It is very it's very easy to come up with an idea, but you have to get out in the field. You have to show results, and I think the ones that are doing that who are making a difference are seeing success. I like to generally close with this question: you're in a tough industry. We're in a healthcare is tough. We sometimes deal with people at their most difficult times, but there's something that gets us up every day and makes us love what we do. So, what is it? You've been in senior care quite a long time. What is it that you love about it, and what keeps you excited every day when you wake up?
Sure. I discovered this over the last few years on trying to figure out like what is really my why, because I've done a lot of
Hmm.
different things in healthcare. And I really do like building leaders and focusing on the teams, because I feel like the best quality care that either residents, patients, no matter what spot they're in, is the best leadership that we have on site, whether it's from aides to executive directors. That's where we're going to get the quality care. And if I can get those folks, motivated and believing in themselves and really building something there, then that's how, we get quality outcomes. And also, it's just really kind of cool to see other folks really grow within their career. So I find joy in that. And so that's kind of really why I do all the connections and educational posts and things like that.
Yeah, healthcare is, and I certainly hope will always remain a people business, a relationship business, a trust business. And in order to do that, you have to invest in the people who are doing it. And so I couldn't agree with that why and anymore. And Tara, it's been a pleasure having you today. You are clearly a wealth of knowledge in this space, and I thank you for helping us kick this off. It's an important, sometimes vulnerable group of individuals that you're caring for, and I'm really grateful to see the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
And to everyone else, thank you so much for listening today. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. We will see you next time on the Healthcare Algorithm. Until then, be well.